The concrete walls of Riverside County Detention Center had witnessed 23 years of human misery, but nobody seemed to notice anymore. Built in 1987 as a temporary solution to overcrowding, the facility had become a permanent monument to society's forgotten people. 347 inmates lived in spaces designed for 200, sleeping on concrete floors when bunks ran out, sharing meals that barely met nutritional standards, and receiving medical attention that often came too late. Maria Santos first walked through those gates on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying nothing but a clipboard and an uncomfortable feeling in her stomach. As a newly certified paralegal, she had volunteered to help with legal aid services, expecting to spend a few hours filling out paperwork and maybe helping someone understand their court dates. She had no idea she was about to witness something that would change her life completely. The intake room smelled like disinfectant mixed with desperation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on peeling paint and cracked linoleum. Maria sat at a folding table, waiting for her first client, when she heard shouting from somewhere deep in the facility. The corrections officer beside her didn't even look up from his magazine. "That happens all day," Officer Reynolds said, turning a page. "You get used to it." But Maria couldn't get used to it. When James Mitchell shuffled into the room 20 minutes later, shackled at the ankles and wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his thin frame, she saw something that made her heart sink. This 62-year-old man, awaiting trial for a minor theft charge, had been in detention for 8 months because he couldn't afford the $500 bail. His diabetes medication had run out 6 weeks ago, and despite multiple requests to the medical staff, he hadn't received proper treatment. "My feet are going numb," James told her, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep asking the nurse, but she says there's a waiting list. Been on that list for 2 months now." Maria looked at his case file. James had stolen groceries worth $37, bread, milk, and insulin from a pharmacy. His Social Security disability check hadn't arrived on time, and he needed food and medicine to survive. Now he was trapped in a system that was slowly killing him while he waited for justice. "Has anyone contacted your family?" Maria asked. James shook his head. "Don't have nobody. That's why I'm still here." After the meeting, Maria walked through the facility with Officer Reynolds, who had agreed to show her around. What she saw made her understand why James was suffering. The medical wing had one part-time nurse for over 300 inmates. The law library consisted of 3 outdated legal books on a broken shelf. The mental health counselor visited twice a week for 2 hours each time. Most inmates waited months to see a doctor, and many never saw one at all. In Cell Block D, Maria met Robert Chen, a 24-year-old college student who had been arrested during a protest 6 months earlier. His bail was set at $10,000 for charges that would likely be dropped, but his immigrant parents feared drawing attention to themselves and couldn't raise the money. Robert had lost 40 pounds since his arrest, and his hair was falling out from stress and poor nutrition. "My mom visits once a week," Robert told Maria through the cell bars. "She cries every time. I tell her I'm okay, but look at me. I'm disappearing." 3 cells down, she met Patricia Williams, a 38-year-old mother of 2 who had been arrested for unpaid traffic tickets. Patricia had been in detention for 4 months, missing her daughter's graduation and her son's birthday. Her children were staying with neighbors who were struggling to care for them. "The court-appointed lawyer saw me for 5 minutes, Patricia explained. "Said I should take a plea deal, serve my time, and get out. But if I plead guilty, I lose my job, and my kids got nowhere to go. If I fight it, I sit here for who knows how long." Maria's clipboard felt heavy in her hands. She had come to help with paperwork, but these people didn't need forms filled out. They needed someone to see them as human beings. They needed medical care, legal representation, and basic dignity. Most of all, they needed someone to remember they existed. That evening, Maria sat in her car outside the detention center for 30 minutes before driving home. She couldn't stop thinking about James's numb feet, Robert's hollow cheeks, and Patricia's desperate love for children she couldn't reach. When she finally started the engine, she made a decision that surprised even herself. The next morning, Maria called her supervisor at the legal aid office and asked if she could spend more time at the detention center. Then she called her friend David Reeves, a social worker who had mentioned wanting to help underserved populations but hadn't found the right opportunity. "I need to show you something," Maria told David. "But I warn you, once you see it, you can't unsee it." David met her at Riverside County Detention Center the following afternoon. As they walked through the facility, Maria watched his face change. The easy smile he usually wore faded as they passed overcrowded cells, listened to coughing that echoed through the corridors, and spoke with inmates who hadn't received visitors in months. "This is happening 20 minutes from our homes," David said quietly. "How did we not know about this?" "Because nobody talks about it," Maria replied. "These people don't have lobbyists or campaign funds. They don't vote in large numbers. They just disappear into the system, and the system forgets about them." David started volunteering the next week. He focused on connecting inmates with family members who had lost touch, helping them apply for benefits they were entitled to, and advocating for better conditions with the facility administration. Within a month, he had contacted Robert Chen's parents and helped them understand that visiting their son wouldn't put them at risk. He had also connected Patricia Williams with a pro bono attorney who was willing to fight her case properly. But 2 volunteers weren't enough. Maria and David were making small differences in individual lives, but the systemic problems remained overwhelming. James Mitchell still wasn't receiving proper medical care. The overcrowding was getting worse, not better. The food service had been cut back to save money, leaving inmates hungry and malnourished. That's when Maria met Dr. Jennifer Walsh. Dr. Walsh was a retired physician who had started volunteering at local clinics after ending her private practice. She was in her 70s, but moved with the energy of someone half her age. When Maria approached her about the medical situation at the detention center, Dr. Walsh's response was immediate and fierce. "You're telling me diabetics are going without insulin?" Dr. Walsh demanded. "People with heart conditions aren't getting their medication? That's not just neglect, that's medical malpractice." Dr. Walsh visited the detention center the following week, and what she found horrified her. The facility's medical records were incomplete and disorganized. Inmates were receiving medications months out of date or not at all. Mental health issues were being ignored completely, leading to suicide attempts and violent outbreaks that could have been prevented. "This isn't a detention center," Dr. Walsh told Maria and David. "This is a warehouse where they store people until they die." Within days, Dr. Walsh had organized a team of retired medical professionals willing to volunteer their time. She contacted the local medical association, wrote letters to newspapers, and began documenting every medical violation she could find. But the facility administration wasn't interested in outside help. "We have our own medical staff," the warden told Dr. Walsh during their first meeting. "We appreciate your concern, but we have procedures to follow." "Your procedures are killing people," Dr. Walsh replied without hesitation. "James Mitchell is going to lose his feet if he doesn't get insulin soon. Robert Chen is showing signs of severe malnutrition. Patricia Williams is having panic attacks that require medication. These aren't procedures, they're human rights violations." The warden ended the meeting without making any commitments. That evening, Maria, David, and Dr. Walsh sat in a small diner near the detention center, planning their next move. Around them, other customers ate dinner and talked about their normal problems, while 347 human beings suffered in silence just a few miles away. "We can't work within their system," Dr. Walsh said, stirring her coffee absently. "They don't want help. They want to be left alone to do whatever is cheapest and easiest." "So what do we do?" David asked. Maria looked out the window toward the detention center, its lights visible in the distance like a grim beacon. Somewhere in that building, James was probably lying awake, worried about his feet. Robert was probably writing another letter to parents who were afraid to visit. Patricia was probably staring at the ceiling, thinking about children she couldn't hold. "We make noise," Maria said finally. "We make so much noise that they can't ignore us anymore." None of them knew it yet, but their small group of 3 was about to become something much larger. Word was spreading through the community about what was happening at Riverside County Detention Center. Other people were starting to ask questions, starting to care about neighbors they had never met, but whose humanity demanded recognition. The system had counted on silence and apathy to continue its work. But silence was about to be broken by people who refused to let their fellow human beings disappear without a fight. James Mitchell, Robert Chen, Patricia Williams, and hundreds of others like them were about to discover that someone did care after all. The concrete walls that had witnessed 23 years of human misery were about to witness something different. They were about to see what happens when ordinary people decide that every human life has value, regardless of circumstances, and refuse to accept suffering as inevitable. Change was coming to Riverside County Detention Center, carried by people who had no official authority, no special training, and no expectation of reward. They had only their conviction that human beings deserved better than what the system was providing. And sometimes, that was enough to move mountains. The first newspaper article appeared on a Thursday morning in late April. Sarah Martinez, a reporter for the local paper, had been covering city council meetings for 3 years when she received an unusual phone call from Dr. Jennifer Walsh. By Friday afternoon, Sarah was standing in the visitors' room of Riverside County Detention Center, interviewing James Mitchell about his deteriorating health condition. The article ran on Sunday's front page with the headline, "Diabetic Inmate Goes Without Insulin for 2 Months." It included a photograph of James's swollen feet and a detailed account of the medical neglect happening inside the facility. The county administration's response came swiftly and defensively. The article contains numerous inaccuracies and presents a biased view of our operations, County Supervisor Michael Torres announced at a press conference Monday morning. Riverside County Detention Center operates within all legal guidelines and provides appropriate medical care to all inmates. But the damage was done. Sarah's article had awakened something in the community that the authorities hadn't expected. Phone calls began flooding the county offices from concerned citizens who had never thought much about detention centers before. Letters to the editor filled the newspaper for weeks afterward. Most surprisingly, other inmates' families started coming forward with their own stories. Carmen Rodriguez had been trying to get help for her son Miguel for months before reading Sarah's article. Miguel had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder in high school, but his medication had been discontinued after his arrest for public intoxication. Without proper treatment, he had become increasingly unstable, spending most of his time in solitary confinement for behavioral issues that were actually symptoms of his untreated mental illness. "I kept calling and asking why my son couldn't have his medication," Carmen told Maria during their first meeting. "They said the jail doctor would evaluate him, but that was 4 months ago. Yesterday, Miguel called me crying, saying he wanted to die. That's not my son talking, that's his illness." Maria introduced Carmen to Dr. Walsh, who immediately recognized the signs of psychiatric medication withdrawal. Together, they began documenting Miguel's case, while also working with 12 other families who had contacted them after the newspaper article appeared. The small group that had started with 3 volunteers was growing rapidly. David Reeves had recruited 2 of his social worker colleagues, and Dr. Walsh had convinced 4 other retired medical professionals to join their efforts. They called themselves the Riverside Detention Advocacy Group, and they met every Tuesday evening at the community center to coordinate their work. But growth brought new challenges. The facility administration, facing public scrutiny for the first time in years, began making their volunteer work more difficult. Visit schedules were suddenly restricted. Volunteer applications were delayed for weeks pending additional security reviews. Medical records that had been accessible before were suddenly classified as confidential. "They're trying to shut us out," Maria told the group during their fourth Tuesday meeting. "Last week they told me I could only visit inmates on my approved list, and that list keeps getting shorter." The pushback was systematic and deliberate. When Dr. Walsh tried to bring donated medical supplies to the facility, she was told that all donations required approval from the county health department, a process that could take up to 6 months. When David attempted to set up a legal clinic to help inmates with basic paperwork, he was informed that all legal activities required supervision by a detention center employee, but no employees were available for such supervision. Most frustratingly, inmates began reporting retaliation for speaking with advocates. Robert Chen was moved to a different cell block after his interview with Sarah Martinez. James Mitchell was told his commissary privileges were suspended for security concerns. Patricia Williams was warned that continued contact with outside advocates might negatively affect her case review. The message was clear. The system would protect itself by punishing the most vulnerable people caught within it. That's when Father Michael O'Brien decided to get involved. Father O'Brien had been the pastor at St. Mary's Catholic Church for 18 years, serving a congregation that included many families affected by the detention center. When Carmen Rodriguez approached him about her son Miguel's situation, he initially offered to pray for the family and provide spiritual support. But after meeting with Maria and Dr. Walsh, Father O'Brien realized that prayer alone wouldn't solve systemic problems. "Jesus called us to visit the imprisoned," Father O'Brien told his congregation during Sunday morning Mass. "He didn't say to visit them only if it was convenient, or only if the authorities approved, or only if they deserved our help. He said to visit them because they are our neighbors, and we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves." Father O'Brien's involvement changed the dynamic significantly. As a religious leader with deep community ties, he brought credibility and moral authority that the detention center administration found harder to dismiss. When he requested permission to provide spiritual services to inmates, the facility couldn't deny the request without appearing to violate constitutional protections for religious freedom. But Father O'Brien used his access differently than traditional chaplains. Instead of focusing solely on religious services, he documented conditions, listened to complaints, and reported what he witnessed to the advocacy group. His weekly reports became crucial evidence of ongoing problems that the administration claimed didn't exist. "The shower facilities in Cell Block C haven't had hot water for 3 weeks, Father O'Brien reported during a Tuesday meeting in June. "Men are getting sick from the cold, but they're being told it's a budget issue that won't be fixed until next fiscal year. The commissary is selling expired food," he continued. "I saw canned goods that expired 8 months ago, and when I mentioned it to the guard, he said inmates should be grateful for any food they can buy." Armed with Father O'Brien's reports and Dr. Walsh's medical documentation, the advocacy group decided to escalate their efforts. They filed formal complaints with the State Health Department, the County Board of Supervisors, and the American Civil Liberties Union. They organized letter-writing campaigns and started a petition demanding improved conditions. The response was swift and harsh. Maria received a call on a Wednesday morning in July from Officer Reynolds, who had become sympathetic to their cause over the previous months. "You need to be careful," he warned her. "Management is looking for reasons to ban your group from the facility. They're saying you're disrupting operations and creating security risks." The warning proved accurate. By the end of the week, new visitor restrictions were implemented that made advocacy work nearly impossible. Volunteers could only meet with inmates for 30 minutes per visit, only once per week, and only with advanced approval from the facility administrator. Dr. Walsh was told her medical volunteer application was being reviewed for potential conflicts of interest. The restrictions were legally questionable, but fighting them would require time and resources the advocacy group didn't have. Worse, the inmates they were trying to help were paying the price for the attention. James Mitchell was moved to a cell with no window after his case received media coverage. Miguel Rodriguez was placed in isolation after his mother filed complaints about his psychiatric treatment. "We're making things worse for them," David said during an emergency meeting called to address the retaliation. "Maybe we should back off until things cool down." "That's exactly what they want us to do," Dr. Walsh replied firmly. "They're counting on us to give up when things get difficult. If we walk away now, James and Miguel and Patricia will suffer even more, and nothing will change." The debate continued for hours, with some members arguing for a tactical retreat and others insisting they had to press forward. Finally, Carmen Rodriguez, who had been quietly listening to the discussion, stood up to speak. "My son called me yesterday," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "He told me that for the first time in months, he feels like someone cares about him. He said knowing that people on the outside are fighting for him gives him hope to keep going. If we quit now, what does that tell him? What does that tell all of them?" Carmen's words settled the debate. The group voted unanimously to continue their work, despite the risks and obstacles, but they needed a new strategy. Direct confrontation with the detention center administration had led to retaliation against inmates and restrictions on advocates. Legal challenges were slow and expensive. Media attention helped raise awareness, but also triggered defensive responses from county officials. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: former inmates. Carlos Mendez had been released from Riverside County Detention Center 6 months earlier after serving 8 months for drug possession. His experience there had been similar to current inmates: inadequate medical care, poor food, overcrowding, and general neglect. But unlike current inmates, Carlos could speak publicly without fear of retaliation. "I lost 30 pounds in 8 months, Carlos told a packed room at the community center during the advocacy group's first public meeting. "Not because I was trying to lose weight, but because the food was so bad I couldn't eat it. I watched men get sick and die because they couldn't get medicine. I saw people have mental breakdowns because they were locked in cells 22 hours a day with nothing to do and no one to talk to." Carlos's testimony was powerful because it came from lived experience. He could describe conditions inside the facility with authority that no outside advocate possessed. More importantly, he could connect current problems to systemic issues that had been ignored for years. Other former inmates began joining the meetings, each bringing stories that corroborated and expanded the picture of institutional neglect. They formed a former inmates advisory committee, providing the advocacy group with insights and perspectives that had been missing from their work. The advisory committee's first recommendation surprised everyone. They suggested focusing less on individual cases and more on policy changes that would affect all inmates. Instead of trying to get insulin for James Mitchell, they should demand that the facility stock all essential medications. Instead of fighting for Robert Chen's family visits, they should push for transportation assistance that would help all families maintain contact with detained relatives. This shift in strategy proved more effective than anyone had anticipated. Policy-focused advocacy was harder for the administration to characterize as disruptive or security-threatening. Demands for systematic improvements resonated with community members who were concerned about fairness and human rights, but weren't necessarily interested in individual cases. By late summer, the Riverside Detention Advocacy Group had grown to include over 60 active volunteers, representing churches, community organizations, and professional associations. They had formed subcommittees focusing on medical advocacy, legal support, family services, and policy reform. Most importantly, they had maintained their commitment to the people inside the detention center despite mounting pressure to give up. The system that had relied on public indifference and institutional inertia was discovering that some problems couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Change was proving more difficult and more expensive than anyone had expected, but it was also proving inevitable once enough people decided to care. Inside Riverside County Detention Center, inmates were beginning to believe that their voices mattered, that their lives had value, and that the world outside hadn't completely forgotten them. That belief was about to become a powerful force for transformation. The turning point came in September, but not in the way anyone expected. James Mitchell collapsed in his cell on a Tuesday morning, his blood sugar dangerously high after weeks without proper medication. By the time the guards found him, he was unconscious and barely breathing. The ambulance ride to County General Hospital saved his life, but the incident created a crisis that the detention center administration could no longer manage quietly. Dr. Susan Chen, the emergency room physician who treated James, was shocked by his condition. His diabetes had progressed to the point where he showed signs of kidney damage and nerve deterioration that could have been prevented with basic medical care. When she learned he had been denied insulin for months while in county custody, she immediately contacted the state medical board and filed a formal complaint about medical neglect. "This man nearly died from a completely treatable condition," Dr. Chen told the local newspaper. "What I saw in his case represents a systematic failure to provide constitutionally required medical care. This isn't just negligence, it's a violation of basic human rights." The story dominated local news for days. Television reporters stood outside the detention center, interviewing Maria Santos and Dr. Walsh about conditions inside the facility. County Supervisor Michael Torres found himself defending policies he had never personally examined, making statements that were quickly contradicted by documented evidence the advocacy group had collected. But the real breakthrough came when James Mitchell himself spoke to reporters from his hospital bed. "I thought I was going to die in that place," James said, his voice weak but determined. "I kept asking for help, kept telling them I needed my medicine, and they kept saying it wasn't their problem. But then these people showed up, people I'd never met, and they fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." James's words, broadcast across the county, crystallized something that had been building for months. This wasn't about criminals getting special treatment or taxpayer money being wasted on undeserving people. This was about human beings suffering unnecessarily, while other human beings with no obligation to care chose to care anyway. The County Board of Supervisors called an emergency meeting for the following week. For the first time in the facility's 23-year history, county officials toured the detention center with independent observers, including Dr. Walsh, Father O'Brien, and representatives from the ACLU. What they found exceeded even the advocates' documented complaints. The medical wing had been storing expired medications for over a year, dispensing them to inmates who had no way to know they were receiving ineffective treatment. The mental health counselor position had been vacant for 6 months, but the county had continued charging the detention center budget for psychiatric services that weren't being provided. Food storage areas showed evidence of rodent infestation, and kitchen equipment hadn't been serviced in 3 years. County Supervisor Lisa Rodriguez, who had initially dismissed the advocacy group's complaints, emerged from the tour visibly shaken. "I've served on this board for 8 years, she told reporters afterward. "I've approved budgets and signed contracts for this facility, and I had no idea conditions were this bad. We failed these people and we failed our community." The board voted unanimously to hire an outside consulting firm to conduct a complete review of detention center operations. They also approved emergency funding for immediate medical improvements and contracted with the county hospital to provide on-site physician services. Most importantly, they established a civilian oversight committee with the authority to inspect the facility and review policies. But bureaucratic changes, however necessary, couldn't address the immediate needs of current inmates. That's where the advocacy group's months of relationship building proved crucial. Dr. Walsh organized a team of volunteer physicians and nurses to work with the new on-site medical staff, ensuring that cases like James Mitchell's received immediate attention. Within 2 weeks, every inmate with diabetes was receiving proper medication and dietary support. Robert Chen was finally getting treatment for the malnutrition and stress-related health problems he had developed during his detention. Father O'Brien expanded the spiritual services program to include mental health support, working with licensed therapists who volunteered their time to address psychological trauma that many inmates had experienced. Miguel Rodriguez was among the first to benefit, finally receiving proper psychiatric medication and counseling for his bipolar disorder. The legal support committee that David Reeves had developed proved equally important. They connected inmates with pro bono attorneys, helped people understand their rights, and provided assistance navigating the complex judicial process. Patricia Williams was finally able to work with a lawyer who took time to understand her case rather than pushing for a quick plea deal. Patricia's situation resolved in October, 6 months after Maria first met her. With proper legal representation, her attorney discovered that several of the traffic citations that led to her arrest had been improperly issued. The charges were dismissed, and Patricia was released to return to her children. But her experience had changed her profoundly. "I can't forget the women who are still in there," Patricia told the advocacy group after her release. "They're facing the same problems I had, but they don't have families who can hire lawyers or advocates who care about them. I want to help." Patricia became the advocacy group's first formerly detained member, joining Carlos Mendez and the other former inmates who were working to ensure current detainees received better treatment. Her insights about the specific challenges facing mothers in detention led to new programs providing child care support and family communication services. By December, the transformation at Riverside County Detention Center was evident to anyone paying attention. Medical emergencies had dropped by 70% since proper health care was implemented. The number of inmates requiring psychiatric intervention had decreased significantly after mental health services were restored. Perhaps most telling, the facility's notorious reputation for violence had improved as basic human needs were being met. The changes weren't limited to health care and legal services. The advocacy group's research had revealed that many inmates were detained longer than necessary because they couldn't afford bail for minor offenses or lacked transportation to court hearings. Working with local churches and community organizations, they established a bail assistance fund and a volunteer transportation program. Robert Chen was among the first beneficiaries of these expanded services. After 7 months in detention, his family was finally able to post bail with assistance from the advocacy fund. The charges against him were eventually dropped, but his experience had motivated him to study law with the goal of defending other protesters and activists who found themselves caught in the justice system. "Those months changed my entire perspective," Robert explained during an advocacy group meeting in January. "I thought I understood injustice before, but I had no idea how the system actually works. Now I want to be the lawyer I needed when I was locked up." James Mitchell's story had a different but equally powerful ending. His health had stabilized with proper medical care, and his case had become a symbol of the detention center's transformation. But James chose not to focus on what he had suffered, instead emphasizing what he had gained. "I found out there are people in this world who care about strangers," James said during a community forum celebrating the facility's improvements. "I thought I was going to die alone and forgotten, but these folks showed up and reminded me that my life matters. That's something nobody can take away from me." The success at Riverside County Detention Center began attracting attention from other communities facing similar problems. Advocacy groups in neighboring counties reached out for guidance on organizing their own efforts. State legislators introduced bills requiring independent oversight of all detention facilities. National civil rights organizations pointed to Riverside as an example of grassroots advocacy creating systematic change. Maria Santos, who had started the entire effort with nothing more than a clipboard and an uncomfortable feeling, found herself speaking at conferences across the state about community-based prison reform. She always made sure to emphasize that their success hadn't come from special expertise or unlimited resources. "We were just ordinary people who decided that other human beings deserved better treatment," Maria told audiences. "We didn't have fancy degrees in criminal justice or big budgets for legal challenges. We had compassion and stubbornness, and it turned out that was enough." Dr. Walsh, now in her mid-70s, had become the volunteer medical director for 3 detention facilities in neighboring counties. Her model of retired healthcare professionals donating their skills had been adopted by medical societies across the state, improving conditions for thousands of detained people. "Retirement doesn't mean you stop caring about human suffering," Dr. Walsh explained to a group of physicians considering volunteer work. "These people need medical care just like any other patients. The fact that they're behind bars doesn't change their humanity." David Reeves had expanded his social work practice to focus exclusively on criminal justice reform, helping families navigate the complex systems that affected their detained relatives. His waiting list included clients from 5 counties, all seeking the kind of compassionate advocacy that had made such a difference at Riverside. The oversight committee established by the county board had become a model for civilian participation in detention center management. Committee members, including several advocacy group founders, conducted monthly facility inspections, reviewed policies, and ensured that the improvements achieved through public pressure were maintained through ongoing vigilance. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The community that had once ignored its detention center now paid close attention to what happened there. Local churches included detained people in their prayers and programs. High school students organized supply drives and letter-writing campaigns. College students completed internships with the advocacy group, learning about social justice through direct service. The concrete walls of Riverside County Detention Center still stood, housing people awaiting trial and serving sentences. But those walls no longer contained forgotten human beings suffering in silence. They contained neighbors, community members, and fellow humans whose dignity was recognized and protected by people who had chosen to care. 2 years after Maria Santos first walked through the detention center gates with nothing but a clipboard, she returned for a ceremony honoring the advocacy group's work. The same intake room where she had met James Mitchell was now bright and clean, with updated furniture and informational posters about inmates' rights. The medical wing buzzed with activity as volunteer physicians and nurses worked alongside paid staff to provide comprehensive health care. Standing in the visitors' room where she had first realized the scope of human suffering hidden behind bureaucratic indifference, Maria reflected on what they had accomplished. They hadn't eliminated poverty, ended addiction, or solved the complex social problems that led people into the criminal justice system. But they had proven that when ordinary people refuse to accept unnecessary suffering, extraordinary change becomes possible. The title of their informal group, people who cared for the imprisoned when no one else seemed to, had become literally true. They were the people who showed up when showing up made all the difference. They were proof that human compassion, properly organized and persistently applied, could transform even the most entrenched institutional failures. Outside the detention center, life continued as normal for most community members. But inside those walls, 347 human beings lived with dignity, received proper medical care, and knew that their lives mattered to people they might never meet. For James Mitchell, Robert Chen, Patricia Williams, Miguel Rodriguez, and hundreds of others, that knowledge made all the difference between despair and hope. Between suffering alone and being part of a community that refused to let anyone disappear without a fight. The imprisoned were no longer forgotten, because people had chosen to remember them. And in that simple act of remembering, humanity had triumphed over institutional indifference, proving once again that caring for strangers is perhaps the most powerful force for change in the world.